My name is Brielle Hart. I'm 31 years old, and for a long time, I believed I had built a life that couldn't be quietly taken from me. I ran a home renovation business in Colorado. Not glamorous, not flashy, just steady, honest work. Early mornings, long days, calloused hands, and clean books. The kind of business where your reputation matters more than your logo. I owned my tools. I paid my crews on time. I liked knowing exactly where every dollar went. And for 5 years, I believed I had a solid marriage with Evan Hart, my husband. He was 32, charismatic in the way people often mistake for reliability. Before the pandemic, he worked in commercial real estate finance. When everything shut down, his job disappeared almost overnight. I told myself that was no one's fault. Marriages are supposed to absorb shock. You lean in, you adapt. At least that's what I believed back then. What I didn't understand yet was that collapse doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as patience or trust. I had been married once before. That marriage gave me my daughter, Lila, who was already 24 and helping with the accounting side of my business. She was sharp, observant, more observant than I like to admit. One afternoon, almost casually, she asked, "Mom, does Dad always put his phone face down at dinner?" I laughed it off. "He's probably just scrolling," I said. But habits don't change without reasons. Evan had been unemployed for months when he joined what he called a professional networking group. They met at upscale wine bars, 3 nights a week. He framed it as strategy, connections, visibility, staying relevant in a stalled industry. At first, I supported it. I asked about the people he met, the firms, the opportunities. Over time, his answers thinned. Same crowd. Nothing concrete yet, just conversations. Then his phone started living face down on every surface. He took calls outside. Texts arrived late at night. When I asked who they were from, he shrugged. Industry people. That phrase started doing a lot of work in our marriage. Money conversations shifted next. We weren't struggling. But Evan started talking like my income was a shared safety net he had access to without contribution. He commented on expenses, suggested I raise my rates, asked why I hadn't expanded faster, hired more crews, taken on risk. Meanwhile, he hadn't brought in income in almost a year. One evening, after a long day on a remodel site, I found him unusually dressed, pressed shirt, cologne, hair styled. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Just running out," he said. No destination, no timeline. He was gone for hours. I stood in the kitchen later, unloading the dishwasher, replaying that moment. The feeling in my chest wasn't jealousy. It wasn't fear. It was that old, quiet alertness, like something real had started stepping around the truth. I had felt it before, back in my first marriage, the moment when reality stops answering direct questions. Lila noticed too. During an office visit, she paused while reconciling accounts and looked at me carefully. "Mom," she asked, "did you move the emergency fund?" "I didn't," I said. "Oh," she replied slowly. "Then someone's been checking it." That night, after Evan fell asleep, I logged into our joint accounts. No withdrawals, no transfers. Just repeated access. Late hours, over and over. Like someone studying a map. Still, I didn't confront him. Part of me wanted proof. Part of me wanted time. And a quieter part, one I didn't want to acknowledge, wanted an exit that didn't involve a fight. I didn't know yet that 6 months later, Evan would sit at our kitchen table and tell me he was keeping the house, the car, and half my business. I didn't know yet that he would say it like a conclusion he'd already rehearsed. What I did know, standing alone in that kitchen, was this. Something in my marriage had already decided to leave. And when the moment finally came, I would be ready. If someone had asked me back then, when my marriage started to fail, I wouldn't have had an answer. Not a clean one, anyway. There was no explosion, no screaming match that split things down the middle. It was quieter than that. It was Evan's job disappearing and never really being replaced, except by explanations. Temporary ones. Optimistic ones. Promises that always landed just far enough in the future that I couldn't hold them accountable. At first, I didn't mind carrying more of the weight. That's what marriage is, I told myself. One person stumbles, the other steadies them. You don't keep score. But scorekeeping has a way of happening anyway. Evan started talking about rebuilding momentum, about how real opportunities didn't come from resumes anymore, but from presence, from being seen, from staying visible in the right circles. That was how he justified the wine bars. 3 nights a week, always different places, always expensive enough that I noticed the charges even before he mentioned them. It's an investment, he said once, swirling his glass, like the gesture itself was proof. You have to spend money to get back into the game. I nodded. I wanted to believe him. What I didn't believe, at least not yet, was how carefully he was separating that world from me. He stopped inviting me along, stopped talking about who he met. When I asked, his answers felt practiced. Same people, nothing solid, just conversations. Conversations that didn't need witnesses, apparently. The phone stayed face down, always. On the table, on the counter, even on the nightstand between us. He'd take it with him to the bathroom, set it screen down by the sink when he showered, flip it over instinctively whenever I walked into the room. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, I didn't confront him. Part of me wanted certainty. Part of me wanted leverage. And a quieter part, one I barely acknowledged, wanted a way out that didn't require begging or shouting. 2 weeks later, the photo arrived. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was arguing with a supplier about delayed cabinets when my phone buzzed. A message from Brent, someone I trusted enough to know he wouldn't send something like this unless it mattered. No text, just an image. Evan, a wine bar I recognized. Low lighting, marble table, his hand resting casually on a woman's arm. She wasn't dressed like someone networking. She was dressed like someone being chosen. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. Everything inside me went very still. I finished the conversation at the counter, walked to my truck, and sat there with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel while the world kept moving around me. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove somewhere quiet and made the call that would change the course of everything. My mother answered on the second ring. I told her what I'd seen, what I'd felt, what I was afraid of saying out loud. She listened without interrupting. Then she said calmly, "If your husband is planning to leave, Brielle, then he's already stopped being your partner, and partners don't get the benefit of blind trust." That was the first night I slept without Evan beside me. He didn't notice, and that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't sleep much that night. Evan was still out when I got home, the house quiet in that hollow way that feels less like peace and more like abandonment. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop closed, phone face down, just breathing, not crying, not spiraling, thinking. By the time Evan came in, close to midnight, I was already in bed pretending to sleep. He moved carefully, like someone who didn't want to be noticed. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already knew. The next morning, after he left, no explanation, no kiss, just a vague, "I'll be out most of the day." I called my mother again. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She asked, "Do you want to survive this, or do you want to be fair?" The question startled me. "I don't want to hurt him," I said automatically. "I didn't ask that," she replied. "I asked whether you want to survive." My mother had never been sentimental about money, or people, when it came down to it. She'd spent decades as a financial controller, watching companies implode because someone trusted the wrong person for too long. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "If he's cheating and planning his exit, he's also planning how to land, and he will land on you if you let him." I closed my eyes. "What do I do?" She exhaled once. "Steady. Controlled. You stop thinking emotionally and start thinking legally." That afternoon, she connected me with Ruth Calder, the family attorney who had handled our estate planning years earlier. Ruth was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed, direct, and utterly uninterested in drama. She didn't ask me how heartbroken I was. She asked for timelines. When did the behavior change? When did he stop working? When did he start accessing joint accounts? I answered everything honestly. Ruth leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "If your husband is preparing for divorce," she said, "then you need to prepare faster, but cleanly." She was very clear about that last word. Nothing hidden, nothing sloppy, everything at fair market value, proper documentation, real transfers. I felt a flicker of guilt. Is that manipulative? Ruth didn't even blink. It's defensive. There's a difference. Over the next hour, she laid out options with surgical calm. What was marital property? What was separate? What could be sold? What couldn't? What would stand up in court if questioned? By the time I left her office, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from clarity. Over the next 2 months, while Evan continued his wine bars and late nights, I quietly reorganized my entire financial life. I sold the house to my mother at fair market value. Real money changed hands. The deed was notarized and recorded with the county. I sold the car, Evan's pride and joy, to her as well. Again, fair value. Clean paperwork. My mother immediately offered to lease the house back to me. A reasonable rate. A formal lease. No shortcuts. Every step was documented. Every transfer traceable. Evan never noticed. That was the part that hurt the most. He lived in the house, slept in the bed, ate the food, and never once asked about the finances he later claimed were his. 6 months passed. He grew bolder, smugger, more confident, and I waited. Because when someone thinks they're winning, they stop checking the ground beneath their feet. And I was already standing on solid ground. By the time Evan decided it was time to make his move, I had already lived through the ending in my head a dozen different ways. That was the strange part. Once I stopped reacting emotionally, everything became quieter, sharper. I moved through the days like someone watching a play they'd already read the script for. I laughed at the right moments, asked the right questions, played my role convincingly enough that even I almost believed it again. Evan, on the other hand, seemed energized. There was a lightness to him I hadn't seen in years. He hummed while getting dressed. He stopped complaining about money. He stopped pretending to look for work. It was as if some internal countdown had reached its final phase and he no longer felt the need to hide it. He started staying out later. Sometimes he wouldn't come home at all. When I asked where he had been, he smiled like I was adorable for worrying. "You know how it is," he said. "Talking turns into networking. Networking turns into drinks." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I was done giving him emotional reactions he could use against me later. The only thing that still surprised me was how confident he was. He made comments that felt premature. Once, while I was reviewing invoices at the kitchen counter, he leaned against the doorway and said casually, "You know, when things shift, we'll have to rethink how we divide responsibilities." "Shift how?" I asked without looking up. He smiled. "You'll see." Another time he actually joked, about how complicated divorces were, about how people underestimated what they were entitled to, about how judges always saw through fake asset transfers. I remember watching him talk, thinking how strange it was to hear someone outline their own misunderstanding so confidently. The night he sent the text, I was ready. "We need to talk. Be home at 6. No emojis, no explanation. I left the job site early, showered, and changed into clean clothes. Nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic, just practical, the way you dress when you know you're about to walk into something permanent. When I pulled into the driveway, there was an unfamiliar car parked behind mine. I felt nothing. Inside, the house was too neat. The lights were brighter than usual, the table cleared, except for a single folder placed carefully at the center. Evan was sitting there. So was a woman I recognized from the photo, younger, polished, watching me with open curiosity. And beside her, a man in a suit I had never seen before. Evan didn't stand when I walked in. He smiled. "Brielle," he said, like he was greeting a client. "Thanks for coming home on time." I set my bag down slowly. The lawyer cleared his throat. "I represent Mr. Hart," he said. The woman crossed her legs, resting a manicured hand on Evan's arm like it belonged there. Evan folded his hands on the table and finally said the words he had clearly rehearsed. "I'm keeping the house," he said, "the car, and half your company." He paused, watching my face. "You can keep your tools." For a moment, no one spoke. Not because I was shocked, because I was processing how thoroughly he believed himself. I looked at the folder, the strangers at my table, the man I had once trusted with my life, and something in me went very still. "Keep it all," I said. Evan blinked. I picked up my jacket, turned, and walked out of the house without another word. I drove straight to Ruth's office. Behind me, Evan was probably celebrating. He had no idea the ground had already shifted. I didn't go back to the house that night. After leaving Ruth's office, I drove until the city thinned out and the roads turned quiet, pulled into a hotel parking lot, and sat in the car for a long time with the engine off. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I kept waiting for the delayed reaction, the shaking, the tears, the collapse. It didn't come. What came instead was exhaustion, the deep bone-level kind that follows clarity. Ruth had been calm when I walked in, as if she'd been expecting me. She didn't ask what happened. She slid a legal pad across the desk and said, "Tell me exactly what he said." I repeated the ultimatum word for word. She nodded once. "Good," she said. "That tells us a lot." "What?" I asked. "That he thinks he already owns things he doesn't," she replied. "And people who believe that tend to overreach." 3 days later, Evan served me with divorce papers. They were thick, aggressive, written like a declaration of war. He was demanding the house, the car, half my business, $4,000 a month in spousal support, and that I cover his legal fees. The audacity of it might have been funny if it hadn't been so deliberate. The papers sat on the kitchen counter when I finally went home. I stared at them for a long time before calling Lila to let her know what was happening. She didn't sound surprised. "I figured," she said quietly. "Do you want me to come by?" "No," I told her. "Not yet. I wanted one thing in this process to stay uncomplicated. Ruth filed our response 2 days later. She called me before sending it. "Do you want the short version or the legal version?" she asked. "Short," I said. "You're in a strong position," she replied, "and he's about to find that out." The response was devastating in its simplicity. The house and the car were not marital assets. They had been sold at fair market value months before the divorce filing. Documentation attached, bank transfers included, county records cited. She offered Evan exactly 50% of our joint checking account, nothing more. My business was separate property, established before the marriage, with no financial or labor contribution from him. Supporting documentation attached. No commentary, no insults, just facts. I imagined Evan reading it, watching his certainty fracture line by line. He didn't take it quietly. Within 48 hours, he went public. A long post appeared on Facebook, accusing me of hiding assets, manipulating finances, and emotionally controlling him throughout our marriage. He painted himself as blindsided, betrayed, abandoned. The comments filled quickly. Sympathy, shock, outrage, mostly from people who didn't know me well enough to question the story. Ruth advised me not to engage. I almost listened. Instead, I posted one thing: links to public county records, dates, deeds, transfers. No explanation, no defense, just proof. The tone online shifted fast. Questions replaced outrage. Confusion replaced certainty. People started noticing what Evan hadn't explained. How you live in a house for months without realizing it's been sold. How you drive a car you no longer own. How someone supposedly controlling could execute transactions so openly. A week later, I heard Evan's new girlfriend, the woman from my kitchen, had stopped appearing in his posts. 2 weeks after that, I heard she'd quietly stepped back entirely. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. Because while Evan was unraveling publicly, I was still sleeping lightly, waking up at every unfamiliar sound, wondering what he'd try next. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The knock came after midnight. That was the first thing that told me something was wrong. I had just fallen asleep when the sound jolted me upright, sharp, insistent, not the kind of knock that belonged to a neighbor or a delivery mistake. Brutus, my old dog Evan never had patience for, barked from the living room, deep and angry in a way I'd never heard from him before. I didn't answer right away. I moved slowly, quietly, every sense on high alert. When I reached the front window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside, my stomach tightened. Evan was standing on the porch. Beside him was a man I didn't recognize, holding a clipboard and a set of tools. A locksmith. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I was dreaming. The scene felt surreal, like something happening in someone else's life, not mine. Then Evan looked up and saw the porch light flick on. His expression hardened. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain in place. "What are you doing?" I asked. Evan stepped forward. "I live here," he said flatly, like it was a legal argument instead of a lie. "You locked me out." "That's not true," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The locksmith shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," he said, "she's saying—" "I have mail here," Evan snapped. "This is my address." I didn't argue. I went back inside, grabbed the folder Ruth had told me to keep by the door, and returned calmly. I handed the papers through the gap. "This is the lease," I said. "And this is the deed. The owner is my mother." Evan's jaw tightened. "I'm calling the police," I said. And then I did. The officers arrived quickly. 2 of them. Professional. Neutral. They asked for documentation, listened without interruption, reviewed the paperwork under the porch light. Evan started raising his voice. "This is my wife," he said. "She's stealing my house." One of the officers looked up at him calmly. "Sir, according to these documents, you have no legal right to this property." Evan laughed, sharp and humorless. "That's ridiculous." The officer didn't smile. "If you don't leave now, you'll be arrested for trespassing." For a moment, I thought Evan might actually push it. His face was red, his hands clenched. The neighbors had started to peek out from behind curtains. Finally, he backed away, pointing at me. "This isn't over," he said. "You're going to regret this." I closed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking now, not from fear of him, but from the realization that he had crossed from entitlement into something else entirely. 2 days later, I was served again. This time it was a restraining order. Evan claimed I'd been harassing him, following him, making threatening calls. The accusations were detailed, confident, completely fabricated. What he didn't know was that I'd been in Denver all week for a contractor conference. I had hotel records, registration badges, receipts, time-stamped photos with colleagues. Ruth didn't even look concerned when I forwarded her the paperwork. "This won't stand," she said. At the hearing, the judge reviewed the evidence quietly. Then he looked directly at Evan. "These allegations don't align with the documented facts," he said. "There are material inconsistencies in your petition." He dismissed the restraining order on the spot, and then he warned Evan about filing frivolous claims. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about assets anymore. It was about control, and Evan was losing it. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning. I arrived early with Ruth, folders stacked neatly in my arms, every document labeled, every timeline printed twice. I felt strangely calm, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond the room we were about to walk into. Evan arrived 5 minutes late. He was dressed in black, not professionally, dramatically, like someone attending a funeral they wanted to be noticed at. His expression was tight, defiant, as if the courtroom were a stage and he was still waiting for his cue. He didn't look at me. Judge Whitman took the bench without ceremony. He was older, composed, the kind of man who had clearly seen every flavor of divorce chaos imaginable and had no patience left for theatrics. Evan's attorney went first. He spoke confidently. Accusations rolled out in neat legal language. Fraudulent transfers, concealed assets, deliberate manipulation in anticipation of divorce. He painted a picture of me as calculating, secretive, financially predatory. I listened without reacting. When it was Ruth's turn, she stood slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She laid out facts, dates, amounts, records. She walked the court through each transaction with methodical precision: the sale of the house at fair market value, the notarized deed, the bank transfers, the lease agreement, the independent valuations, the business formation documents establishing separate property long before the marriage. She handed copies to the clerk. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "these were not hidden transfers. They were lawful sales executed months before any divorce filing, with full documentation and market verification." Judge Whitman leaned forward. Then he turned to Evan. "Mr. Hart," he said, "did you know your wife sold the marital home to her mother?" Evan shifted in his seat. "I knew she was helping sometimes," he said. "I didn't know the details." "So," the judge replied, "you didn't review your household finances for over 6 months?" I trusted her. "And yet you are alleging she deliberately concealed transactions from you?" Evan hesitated. "Yes." The judge paused. "You can't have it both ways," he said calmly. "Either you were involved and should have known, or you were uninvolved and delegated authority. Which is it?" Evan's attorney started to object. The judge waved him off. "I'm trying to understand your client's position." The room went very quiet. Ruth didn't interrupt. She let the silence do its work. The judge continued reviewing documents, occasionally asking for clarification. Evan's confidence visibly drained with each question. I watched his posture change, shoulders sagging, eyes darting to his lawyer for reassurance that never came. After a short recess, the judge returned. His ruling was direct. The house remained my mother's property. The car remained hers as well. My business was confirmed as separate property. The joint checking account would be split evenly. Spousal support was set at $750 a month for 1 year. Each party would pay their own legal fees. And then he added something that felt heavier than the ruling itself. "The court finds no evidence of fraudulent conveyance," he said. "The documentation demonstrates compliance with the law." Evan stared straight ahead. Ruth squeezed my arm under the table. When we walked out of the courtroom, she exhaled softly. "I rarely see cases end this cleanly," she said. I didn't smile. I felt finished. But Evan wasn't. Not yet. I thought the ruling would end it. That was my mistake. The court had been clear. Ruth had been precise. Evan had been publicly dismantled in a room where facts mattered more than volume. In my mind, there was nowhere left for him to go. But losing doesn't always stop people like Evan. Sometimes it just removes the mask. The first sign came 3 days after the hearing. I was at a job site when my phone started buzzing nonstop. Unknown number, then another, then another. I let them go to voicemail until curiosity finally got the better of me. The first message was Evan. His voice sounded different, tight, rushed, like he was talking through clenched teeth. "You think you won?" he said. "You think this is over?" The second message was worse. "You humiliated me," he continued. "You planned this, you set me up, and you're going to pay for it." I forwarded everything to Ruth without responding. She called me back immediately. "Do not engage," she said. "This is emotional fallout. Let him burn it out." But Evan didn't burn out. He escalated sideways. Mutual friends started reaching out, awkward and hesitant. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to check in. Someone asked if I was okay. Another asked if it was true that I had tricked Evan into signing things he didn't understand. I realized then what he was doing. He couldn't win legally, so he was trying to win socially. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I had learned the hard way that explanations just gave him more surface area to attack. Instead, I went quiet. That silence seemed to enrage him more than any response could have. A week later, a postcard showed up in my mailbox. No return address, just his handwriting. "You didn't have to destroy me." I stared at the words for a long time. Destroy. It was fascinating how he framed it, as if consequences were something I'd inflicted, not something he'd earned through his own choices, as if planning ahead was violence. I slid the postcard into the same folder where I kept every other piece of documentation from the divorce. Proof. Around that time, Lila came by unannounced. She stood in the doorway, took one look at my face, and set her bag down. "You're not sleeping," she said. I didn't argue. We sat on the couch with takeout containers between us, the TV on, but muted. And for the first time since all of this started, I let myself feel the weight of it. Not the fear, not the anger, the sadness. "I didn't think he'd turn into this," I admitted quietly. "I didn't think someone could live with you for years, and then rewrite everything." Lila reached over and squeezed my hand. "He didn't turn into this," she said. "He just stopped pretending." That landed harder than anything Evan had said. The final blow came a few days later. Ruth called me mid-morning. "I wanted you to hear this from me," she said. "Evan's attorney is withdrawing from representation." I closed my eyes. "Why?" "Professional differences," she replied, which usually means the client isn't being honest anymore or won't listen. For the first time, I felt something close to relief. Not victory, relief, because the chaos was starting to collapse under its own weight. And all I had done was step out of its way. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar, not peaceful, at least not at first, just empty. Like standing in a house after a storm has passed, listening for drips that might mean something else is still breaking. The legal motion slowed, then stopped. Ruth confirmed that Evan had accepted the court's ruling in full. No appeal, no new filings, no last-minute stunts. It was over. The divorce would be finalized in a matter of weeks, exactly as ordered. I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated, something loud. Instead, I felt tired in a way sleep couldn't touch. The house felt different now. Not haunted, just honest. I started changing things without thinking too hard about it. Small things at first. I moved the table where Evan had delivered his ultimatum, repainted the hallway, took down photos I no longer wanted to explain to myself. One afternoon, I ripped out the lower cabinets in the kitchen. Lila laughed when she saw the mess. "Is this symbolic?" she asked. "Practical," I said. They were poorly installed. We worked side by side for hours, music playing softly, sawdust in our hair. It was the first time since everything began that my body remembered what it felt like to build instead of brace. My business picked up in a way I hadn't expected. Without the constant background stress, without wondering what I'd come home to, I was sharper. Clients noticed. Word spread. We booked months out. I hired another crew. Lila took on more responsibility with scheduling and client communication, handling it with a confidence that made me quietly proud. One evening, while balancing the books, she looked up and said, "You know this is the calmest I've seen you in years." I paused. She was right. Evan faded quickly from my daily life. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved out of state, that he was starting fresh, that he told people the divorce had blindsided him. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't need to. A month after the ruling, my mother offered to sell the house back to me. Same price she'd paid. No markup, no games. We did it cleanly, again. The irony wasn't lost on me that I ended up with more equity than I'd started with. But I didn't celebrate it. I just signed the papers and went back to work. One night, as I locked up the shop, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for the next message, not for the next escalation, not for the next shoe to drop. I was living inside my days again. That's when I knew the war was really over. The divorce finalized quietly. No courtroom, no speeches, just a set of signatures, a final confirmation, and an email from Ruth that read, "It's done." I sat at my desk for a long time after that, staring at the screen, waiting for some kind of emotional aftershock. It didn't come. What came instead was a sense of completion. Not happiness, not triumph, just the absence of tension that had lived in my body for years without me realizing it. Evan moved out of state not long after the papers were signed. I heard he'd ended up in Arizona, renting a small apartment, trying to rebuild. A few months later, someone mentioned he'd tried to reconnect with the woman he'd been seeing during the divorce. It didn't go well. I didn't ask for details. My mother sold the house back to me at the same price she'd paid. No profit, no leverage, just quiet support. I moved back in officially, alone this time, and spent evenings remodeling the space at my own pace. I tore out the kitchen where Evan had delivered his ultimatum and rebuilt it from scratch. New cabinets, clean lines, a deck off the back where I could sit with coffee in the mornings and let the sun remind me that time keeps moving forward whether you're ready or not. Work was steady, better than steady. Without the weight of managing someone else's instability, I made decisions faster, trusted my instincts again. I turned down projects I didn't want, took on ones that excited me. For the first time in a long while, I enjoyed coming home at the end of the day. Lila came over often. Sometimes we worked, sometimes we didn't. One night, while we were watching a movie, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you regret marrying him?" I thought about it longer than I expected to. "No," I said finally. "I regret ignoring myself." That answer surprised us both. I started dating again, casually. Coffee, dinners, conversations that stayed light. I didn't talk about assets. I didn't talk about the divorce unless asked. It felt good to remember what it was like to sit across from someone without calculating risk. A few weeks ago, a postcard arrived in the mail. No return address. "You won. Hope it was worth it." I looked at it for maybe half a minute before slipping it into the drawer with the rest of the paperwork from that chapter of my life. I didn't win. I survived. There's a difference. Protecting yourself isn't cruelty. Planning ahead isn't manipulation. Sometimes, love means recognizing when someone is trying to hurt you and stepping out of their reach. These days, I wake up in my own house. I walk through rooms I rebuilt with my own hands. I go to work creating things that last. It's not flashy, but it's mine, and no one gets close enough to take it from me again.